Hi, this is your host Swapnil Bhartiya and welcome to TFR Let's Talk. Today we have with us Avi Freedman, CEO and co-founder of Kentik. Avi, it's great to have you on the show.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
We have covered Kentik a couple of times before on the show, so our audience, they do know about the company. But since you are here, you're a co-founder, so I would love to know a bit about the origin of the company. What led you to start the company, when and why?
Sure. So I've been running infrastructure, network, as well as systems and distributed systems since, well, for a long time. But I started the first internet provider in Philadelphia back in 1992, and then I was at AboveNet, and then I was at Akamai, where we did things large scale for the time. And after I left Akamai, I actually started selling some network sensors. Like if you remember the show Silicon Valley, the box. And everyone that bought them said, what do we do with all this data? And I thought that was a lot more interesting. So I was running this old thing called Usenet as a hobby. So I had a big distributed system, set up a bunch of stuff, and said, hey, would you like to, lab doing large scale infrastructure and data analytics? And people said, no, we'd much rather have someone else host all this data because we were keeping it all instead of doing roll-ups. And that led me to think there was an opportunity, and I moved to the Bay Area, and we started the company about 10 years ago.
Thanks for sharing the story of the company. I would love to now know that, I've talked to Kentik before. You folks talk about network observability. How would you define network observability? How is it different from, if we can use the word, traditional observability?
I think of observability overall as being able to answer the questions you need to run your services, your infrastructure, the revenue of your company. And at the network level, there's a lot of things that people do where you could take the same data and put it into a database, you could put it into other kinds of observability companies, but can you answer the kind of questions that you're looking for? Can you have the workflows you're looking for? Application people look for certain workflows to debug applications based on traces and performance, and systems people look at the systems performing well, and network people look at things like capacity planning and am I getting to this network okay, and are my bills from my providers going well, and am I sending too much traffic to different places? Kinds of questions that take a different kind of approach. And I think each kind of observability company, designs to be the tool, the platform where people are living. And also network has a lot of cardinality challenges, because if you think about even just IPv4 to the 32, much less IPv6 to the 128th, plus port numbers, plus everything, a lot of the basic questions you ask require some different data substrate to be able to deal with things like denial of service attacks and dynamically, orchestrated applications. So I think it's per the persona as well as some data platform issues.
And when we just look at traditional observability, of course, since we focus a lot on open source here, OpenTelemetry is a project that keeps showing up. It was a merger of a couple of projects, Google and the companies joined and created it. Is OpenTelemetry good enough to fulfill all the needs of observability, or specifically network observability, or you feel that there are some limitations and we need to look beyond it, or we need to add something to it?
In my view, OpenTelemetry, OTel, has been great for the vendors and great for, more importantly, the customers, but is not the whole picture. So I think the promise is portability, being able to take your data anywhere. And we certainly see it even just purely in the network world, but it's a big mandate on the customer side to, go OTel. I would say of 400 some customers, 100 of them, pure enterprise, a lot of service providers. I don't think I can point to anyone that's all OTel, for all their telemetry today, but certainly standardizing, having telemetry buses and Kafka and all that, huge, very important. A couple things that I think are not really well addressed really come down to the semantics, the meaning. So OTel, if you think about it, I can have the format, the transport mechanisms. The format could be like CSV or JSON or GNMI or, and then there's transfer format, and then there's the meaning. And what OTel sort of leaves as an exercise, which I think a lot of business executives think is a solved problem, but isn't, is how do I take this from here where New Relic thinks entities are this and Datadog thinks they're that, and maybe reasons why that's not going to be solved, or maybe it will be solved in OTel. And then there's things that I think come up with network, right? Which is this more like a log or a metric, but it isn't really either, and stuff that I can just see into the future, like eBPF, right? eBPF. Let's say that I want to do security stuff, right? And I want to see the relationship between a bunch of processes and some activities. Well, OTel, that's going to be a metric, a log, or trace. It's not really a trace, but like, how do you put it in? And I think there's also room to expand where a lot of people are sort of viewed as just like the old observability. It's MELT, metrics, events, logs, traces. So I think it's a great start. It gets a lot of work that's important towards portability and really the telemetry bus and being able to use multiple systems. But I'm not sure whether there's the vision to go the next level for what I think is going to be important for the next decade for everyone working in and around observability. So supporter, but I'd like to see it do more.
Can you talk about the role OpenTelemetry plays in the context? You did touch upon that, but I want to we'll be also breaking this into a smaller chunk. Can you also talk about the role OpenTelemetry plays in network observability space?
So very limited. And I can tell you a tale, I'll try to be brief, about, have you heard of SNMP, Simple Network Monitoring Protocol? So people don't like it. People don't like it because you have to pull the devices. People don't like it because it's got weird numbers and OIDs and stuff like that. And in the network world, before OTel was actually a thing, network people said, let's do streaming telemetry. Streaming telemetry where the devices push instead of having to be asked. And when streaming telemetry started, they forgot the MIB. They forgot the database of the meaning. And so every vendor was like the Tower of Babel. It was a different transport format, it was a different encoding, and there was no meaning. Now there's this models and something called OpenConfig, which is sort of the network version of some of this stuff. And streaming telemetry has some standards, which is sort of the network version of it. But it's more network vendor and IETF and not CNCF. And most network operators still have problems figuring out, well, how do I unify SNMP and streaming telemetry? Now take OTel in the side, and there's no real reference or standard for how you take the network stuff and put it in OTel. And people are still struggling with some of this base SNMP and streaming telemetry. How do you put it together? I mean, it's something that we have to deal with as we do metrics is, well, ultimately the router only has so much CPU, however we measure it. So I would say that we're seeing, RFPs, discussions where people say, can you put everything in the network at OTel? And we're just like, sure. How do you want it represented? And they're like, well, we don't know. You tell us. So we have a reference for that. But from a production perspective, a lot of network people are still struggling with this SNMP and streaming telemetry. And OTel is more of okay, we've demonstrated that we can send some of these metrics back and forth, but we don't see that as as an implemented priority in customers today. I think everyone agrees directionally it'd be great to have all the observability systems playing together and to solve these semantics and transport problems, but it's a little early for OTel on the pure network side today.
How does Kentik overcome this limitation of OpenTelemetry so that, when it comes to observability, it doesn't matter whether you're looking at network or system-wide, so teams can, continue to get the data that they need?
So a couple approaches. First, we're trying to help this telemetry unification for network people by unifying SNMP and streaming telemetry, because that's what they're actually like. Most network devices don't speak OTel, so you can't talk to them directly in that. They don't send traffic data as OTel, they send it as something called NetFlow, or cloud as VPC flow logs. For metrics, it's SNMP or streaming telemetry. So as we do metrics on our end, we're unifying the old world SNMP, which is still the vastly predominant in terms of deployed footprint, with streaming telemetry. Then we take an approach where we say everything that comes into Kentik after we do enrichment and normalization and all this stuff, we can stream back out, and then we have an open source catcher for our fire hose called K-Translate that is a telemetry pipeline, and that can speak OTel, and you can filter, roll up, transform. You can send it to Kafka, and you can send it to S3 buckets, and you can, turn it into OTel and send. And on the other end, we have the ability to ingest OTel and map it to network, but we haven't seen anyone actually want to use that. So it's more the output side, which is, can we speak OTel to go into the telemetry bus? Can we speak OTel to send to some other systems? Generally summaries, because again, especially on the traffic analysis perspective, the cardinality can explode a lot of systems if you send the full resolution. And also we have customers that send us actually millions of 80 column wide telemetry points per second. And so to send all that out somewhere else, is going to be a cost. So they really want to send a subset or roll-ups or whatever into the other systems, because all that data is in Kentik. They can pull it via API. So it's unify the network layer and then make it possible to send in any format they want, OTel being one of those. And then, of course, ingest OTel if and when we see that as a primary.
What kind of effort it could be either from the larger open source community or from vendors like Kentik going on to kind of bridge the gap between the standard OpenTelemetry and network observability?
I haven't really seen anything. A lot of the work on streaming telemetry is driven by open source in the network world. As we've engaged on the OTel side, I think the general view is network people can turn it into, logs, metrics, not really traces. So we have a reference implementation that we've given some customers and we'll publish of, here's how you can take network metrics and, put it in OTel and how you would format it so that it could be consistent. But, and the same thing for traffic, which, vaguely goes into logs. But it's also a little bit of a weird dichotomy because CNCF is where a lot of the open source is hosted on the mainstream observability, as you said. In the network world, there isn't really a similar thing. It's IETF, which doesn't really own code. They own more, the Internet Engineering Task Force, more codification of how one does things. And then there's a lot of different projects. Google drives some of them. And as I said, the network world hasn't even solved this SNMP streaming telemetry. The view of streaming telemetry advocates, some of them, is you should just destroy all your things with SNMP, which is happened with IPv6, which is why we still have IPv4, because that's not really practical in the enterprise. So I'd like to see more of that. We'd like to see more of that. Right now it's reference implementations. And my hope would be that, on the pure OTel side, even as it progresses towards graduation, some of these semantics and references become part of that work, and network could be part of that.
When we look at modern world, it is cloud-centric. Now we can talk about distributed cloud, we can talk about decentralized cloud, but there are pipelines running. So networking, network is like the highways, in modern world, but we don't talk much about that. So looking at the role of network in the modern world, how much work, how much emphasis is done on network observability? Is it like the old days of security was, hey, because there used to be silos, storage folks, networking folks, security. Are they still silo, or you're like, of course, people look at it from a holistic point of view? What I'm trying to understand is that whose problem is network observability in teams?
What we're seeing is for companies, most companies, I would say enterprises, maybe starting a couple years ago, the day two operations of cloud networking has come into the IT groups that run their classic networking too. Typically, whether it's they have offices or branches, routers and switches, but the VPC flow logs, the cloud metrics and cloud topology and firewall rules and all that stuff, they may or may not design that, but there's this consolidated desire to be able to answer the question, which is, why did that service mesh not talk to that, or why is the service not working? And so from a tools perspective, often there are silos because these things are separate, and that's what we're trying to break down within the network infrastructure world. Then, even in other words, in the old appliance days, you'd have this thing for the data center and that thing for the WAN and that thing for the internet, and then the cloud comes in. And that's driving a lot of this desire to have more modern systems, which has been great for us. So we have a map. You can look at your AWS, and not like syslogs, but like a network map, because as I said, service meshes don't communicate by ESP. Like as you said, the packets need to get back and forth. But it's true that there are specialized teams looking at that. But then those teams need to be able to, when a ticket comes into the enterprise, is it a network problem? Is it an application problem? Those teams need to be able to work together, which is why I also think that a lot of each observability system is going to be best at certain practitioner, certain types, security for security, network for network, application for application, but they need to work together. They need to interrelate. So I think that's two kinds of silos, right? The job of every observability company is break down the silos for their practitioner and participate with the other platforms that the other practitioners use. But it's still difficult. Like in security and ops, sometimes they do the same thing, but they use different words and don't even understand each other. That's more of a challenge than we as a 200-person company can address. And it's an industry challenge too, but that's probably a separate whole conversation.
When we look at all these practices, sometimes things overlap, sometimes there are gaps. And teams are getting over, especially when I work with in the cloud native Kubernetes space. The first challenge that comes up with complexity, and also we are moving towards a world which is once again more and more cloud centric. Teams, because of all the layoffs happening, are becoming smaller. Are you seeing any trends, any development in the way of reducing this complexity and also kind of break these soft silos? Because the fact is that even if we say, hey, cloud broke all those silos, there are folks who specialize in networking, security, storage, other areas are there. And those, we cannot think of unicorn developers who knows everything. So what kind of trends you are seeing to reduce this complexity? It could be from the perspective of the whole vendor sprawl that we see in the cloud native world, or it could also be to reduce the cost and complexity for teams.
Yeah, I think there's two things that we're seeing that get at that complexity and reducing it. One is having the platforms send the right summaries from their own domain into each other, and sometimes into the SPOGs, the whatever their single pane of glass is. I don't think, again, you're going to get the full breadth of everything, but if you're trying to figure out, is an application slow, is there a network attack, like sending some of those things so that practitioners can see it, that's definitely a trend and helping. The other is AI. Starting with a co-pilot that lets people that maybe don't know what question to ask interact with these systems. Just about every system already has a co-pilot or will shortly. And I think we're going to see in the next couple of years, not the full promise of, humans go home, lights out operation, but some ability to suggest root causes that humans can look at in a way that makes sense to, well, I'm a security. You would tell, the co-pilot, I am a security engineer. Can you please explain to me whether, latency is higher, for certain storage, for certain applications or not, and whether they're dependent on my storage. Questions that you just wouldn't be able to go into and ask of trace-based systems and have the context for, or a network-based system. I think that will help a lot with these questions. And a lot of that we're seeing driven by enterprise saying, look, I have 5 people that understand this complexity, but I have 300 people in a NOC and they don't. I can't hire people, as you said, that have all this background. Help me. So I think integrations and AI, even without the grand promises, is already starting to help people in useful ways. So that's really exciting.
And since you mentioned AI, we talk a lot about Gen AI these days as well. What role do you see AI, Gen AI can play in the observability space?
Well, as I said, one of them is just helping humans. I mean, that's what Gen AI is basically trained on, is a bunch of human blabber. So helping humans ask intelligent questions, I think, is what they're best suited for. Now, in broader AI, I think there's a huge application to some of this. We don't call it root cause, we call it probable cause, because, I don't want to overpromise. And where I think the power is a lot of the observability systems know what the ground truth is. And one of the biggest problems with Gen AI that most people have heard of is hallucinations. Now, I don't like that term because that implies that Gen AI is thinking, but call it nonsense or babble or mispredictions. Um, I'd be nervous about asking current Gen AI to go drive my car completely or configure my application or network or get into avoid feedback loops. But if you actually know how things are connected, this application's to that network to that storage, etc., then I think you can actually ask Gen AI for possibilities and check it against the data that you have. And observability done right is very powerful at the ability to eliminate that nonsense or hallucination. So again, I think that's an area we're actively working in, and I expect over the next couple of years to see this probable cause come out and be really helpful to accelerate humans running this kind of complex infrastructure.
Of course, you may or may not be able to share all the details at this point, but just give us a teaser, a hint of what else to expect from Kentik this year. What kind of things you folks are working on?
Our focus has been bringing the hybrid estate together. You're going to see some more work on Kubernetes, which is sort of a layer above, but is a key part of substrate for a lot of modern applications. Continued work across the clouds, making it make sense to people that are trying to figure out how all the communications in the enterprise are going, and what we talked about, applications of Gen AI towards helping our expert customers as well as making it things more approachable, questions answered to other groups in the company. Those are the key highlights that we're working on right now.
Avi, thank you so much for taking time out today. Talk about the company and the whole evolution of observability space. Thanks for great insights, and I would love to chat with you folks again. Thank you.
That sounds great. Thank you very much. Thanks for the time, and love engaging with your audience and all the smart folks out there.